At the time when he designed this building, the Sheldonian Theatre in Oxford, Christopher Wren was primarily a mathematician and astronomer. He had little experience of designing buildings. What he did have was a superb knowledge of mathematics, clearly of engineering, and a comprehensive knowledge of Greek and Roman antiquity derived from books. So Wren began to design the Sheldonian, only his second work. His first is a very simple chapel for Pembroke College in Cambridge. He began to work on the Sheldonian more in theory than with a knowledge of practical architecture. In those years of civil war and interregnum between the rule of Charles I executed and Charles II restored, simply the arts of architecture are not much cultivated in Britain. It isn't very easy for an ingenious young man like Wren to travel to see France and Italy. It isn't easy to see any examples of architecture in a modern style. Now, where Wren would have picked up would have been from some hints in architecture in Oxford. So we have the porch of the University Church, added by Archbishop Laud, which is a modest essay in Baroque, which was the international style prevalent in the 1630s and afterwards. If we look at, say, the front of Brasenose, built in the 1650s, which faces Radcliffe Square, we see that essentially the bones of the building are a kind of surviving English Gothic. But there is a modest attempt to use some classical features, such as pediments and a formal cornice, but they're used in a very strange, idiosyncratic English way, indicating that English builders are really out of touch with international styles. So Wren had two buildings, as it were, from which he could derive a sense of how a classical building might be undertaken. He also had a formidable knowledge of what we would call something like structural engineering, that the ceiling, the flat ceiling of the wide Sheldonian theatre is achieved not with a dome or a vault, but is actually achieved with a most intricate pattern of interlocking beams which spread and hold the tensions of the weight placed upon them by very careful mathematical calculation of how to spread the load. An important consideration for Wren and the other people keen to construct the Sheldonian theatre was to reflect the dignity of the university by reference to ancient Rome. Now, the building we're talking about here, as Wren's point of reference, is the Theatre of Marcellus in Rome. This explains the shape of the Sheldonian and the many classical references which adorn it, as with the Roman lictors, symbols, they're bundles of rods and axes which adorn the boxes in the main theatre, as in the trophies of classical armour which adorn the doorway facing Broad Street, as in the much-loved figures of herms, that is to say busts on pedestals, which form a semicircle facing Broad Street. So the idea is to reflect the open-air theatre of Roman antiquity. Now, in the British climate, this is not wholly practicable, so the solution is that Wren's engineered flat ceiling has beneath it a ceiling painting representing a cover, or in Latin velarium, being drawn aside by angels to reveal a blue summer sky peopled by allegorical figures. The ceremonial approach to the theatre was in fact from what we now call the Divinity School in the Bodleian Library. Wren, interestingly, made a new doorway in a very convincing Gothic English style to give access to the new forecourt of the Sheldonian Theatre. This explains why the facade of the theatre does not face the street, but faces inwards to the complex of the Bodleian Library and what were then some of the main teaching rooms of the university. So the ceremonial approach to the Sheldonian in Wren's time would have been, in fact, to the facade, which had walls at either end, on which were displayed genuine Roman and Greek, in fact, inscriptions and fragments of sculpture from the collection that then was unified as the Ashmolean Museum. The function of the building is to pick up the ceremonial life of the university as it had been before the war, The style of the building is to pick up the court and elite style of England as it had been before the war, and indeed some of the finances are put together by those people who had been eminent in the university before the war, chiefly Sheldon, Gilbert Sheldon, after whom the theatre is named.